DC from Joyce, Rob, and Eleanor. Mary, thank you very much for making us feel so welcome. Today we are very privileged to have Deano Muduramuthu talking on Symphony No. 5, a symphonic response by Shostakovich to Stalin. If you are a classic FM addict, as I am, you'll certainly be familiar with Deano. I nearly always listen to classic FM when I am driving. On many occasions, he has soothed my frayed nerves with both his voice and his music. Today, we are lucky that we will not only be able to hear his delightful voice, but also see and interact with him. Please use the chat facility on the right of the screen to comment and ask questions. I'm really interested to hear what he has to say about Shostakovich. Thanks, Deano. Over to you, Deano.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's really a pleasure for me to address the U3A. I think my first experience of the organization was when I attended a talk by Daphne and Gerald Zwern. It was about opera, and it was really informative. They both knew opera very well, and I'm really pleased to be able to speak to the U3A this morning. Now, I love classical music, and not only the music, which has a certain depth and beauty and appeal and refinement, but I also find fascinating the stories behind many of the compositions, the most famous compositions in classical music, and the circumstances under which they were composed. Mozart, for example, wrote many symphonies because he had concerts scheduled and he needed music. So he composed symphonies for those. Beethoven composed symphonies because he challenged the conventions of the time, the symphonic conventions of the time. And Hector Berlioz wrote his Symphony No. 1 because he felt very strong emotions towards a certain lady who rejected his feeling. And the Symphony No. 5 by Dmitri Shostakovich is my favorite 20th century symphony. And this is a symphony that's both political and personal. It sprung from the political atmosphere and the climate and the anxieties of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and how that atmosphere affected Shostakovich personally. So that is the matrix, as it were, in which this symphony was composed. Now, Shostakovich was a conservatory pianist, and she gave him his first piano lessons, and she was very surprised at how he would memorize a piano piece, and a fairly complex piano piece, after playing it once or twice, and then he could play it from memory. And so that convinced her that she had a special talent on her hands. And at the age of 13, he was enrolled in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And so he studied there and he graduated, and as a graduation exercise, he composed his Symphony No. 1, which was very well received. Now, Shostakovich was born in 1906 during the era of the Tsar in Russia. And when he graduated, it was the era of the Communist Party. The Bolshevik Revolution had taken place. So Russia had become the Soviet Union, and politically, it was a very, very different place to which he was born. Now, Shostakovich was sympathetic to the communist state. He named his second symphony October, because that was the month during which the revolution took place. And he named his third symphony May Day, as in the 1st of May, which was a very important holiday in the Soviet Union. So he was quite sympathetic to the aims of the communist state. Now, the first signs of official displeasure with Shostakovich happened in 1929 with his opera, The Nose. And that was based on a novel of a man whose nose separates from his face and builds a life of its own. So it's quite an absurd novel. And Shostakovich composed the music for it. And the Russian authorities criticized it as bourgeois decadence. Now, personally, I believe that a little bit of decadence, bourgeois or otherwise, is good for the soul. It functions as a bit of a seasoning, I think. But it seems that the party believed otherwise. So that was the first inkling of official displeasure with Shostakovich's work. And it was a first in a series of events that culminated in the composition of the Symphony No. 5. Well, Shostakovich went on composing works, and in 1934, he wrote an opera called Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. And this too was based on a novel. And the novel concerned a lady who lived in the provincial parts of Russia, and she was married to a successful businessman, but unhappily married, and she had her husband killed, and she took off with her lover, and then they were in prison for the murder, and then her lover abandoned her. So it wasn't a particularly happy story. And so this opera debuted or premiered in 1934 to a bit of success. And this opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, is the reason why Shostakovich's path crossed with that of the Man of Steel. Now, of course, when I say Man of Steel, you're inclined to think Superman, because that was his name. But the actual Man of Steel I have in mind was Joseph Stalin. Stalin, I'm sure, as pretty much everyone knows, his birth name was Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili. And according to one biography that I read, the name Stalin came from an ex-girlfriend of his. She was the daughter of the owner of a steel mill. Her father owned a steel mill, and on account of her boyfriend's nature, his rather severe and unbending and uncompromising and strong personality, she gave him the name Stalin, which stuck with him. And Stalin also was a man of certain artistic inclinations. Again, in one biography, he wrote poetry in his youth, and that poetry was published in the various newspapers in the Caucasus, especially in Baku at the time. Now, where his path crossed with Shostakovich was in 1936, where he attended a performance of the opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. Now, the plot was fairly lurid because it had scenes of murder, of suicide, and of rape. And Shostakovich's music was quite cacophonous and rather noisy. So Stalin attended a performance of the opera in 1936 in Moscow, and he hated it. And he walked out before the performance was completed. And a few days later, the official newspaper Pravda carried a review of Lady Macbeth, and it was a very withering, scathing review. It was titled Chaos Instead of Music. And it referred to the music as a confused stream of sounds, and referred to the opera as, this word again, petty bourgeois sensationalism. And a few days after the scathing review, 9 days later, actually, there was another review of a Shostakovich composition. This time his ballet, The Limpid Stream, was reviewed, and it again was dismissed for its ideological failings. Now, when this happened, Shostakovich knew that he was on very, very dangerous ground. Because what had happened was that the cultural machinery of the state had aligned itself behind Stalin and had trained its eye on him. And he was now under scrutiny for various ideological failings. And he knew full well that these reviews were an expression of Stalin's personal tastes. Now, what had happened at that time was that the cultural commissars wanted music, and rather art, to follow a certain pattern. They wanted art that was uplifting, that where possible or where necessary, made use of folk elements, folk dances and folk songs and folk stories, even folk costumes. And above all, they wanted art and music that encouraged loyalty to the party. And so the way state officials framed this was that the people want. This is what the people demanded of Soviet artists, and any art that had no connection to the lives of the masses was dismissed as bourgeois, and it was seen as something in opposition to the party. So this was a very, very dangerous position for Shostakovich to be in. because bad things happened to people whom Stalin disliked. And Shostakovich has created a work which Stalin found offensive. Not only that, going back to 1929 with the nose, it could be argued that he had a history of bourgeois leanings, something that the party officials took a pretty dim view of. And so this was a very, very traumatic incident for Shostakovich, because years later, he wrote about it and he said, now everyone knew for sure that I would be destroyed. And the anticipation of that noteworthy event has never left me. So it was a very difficult and a very traumatic time for him. And adding to the complication, Shostakovich had already composed his Symphony No. 4, and it was being rehearsed in Moscow, being made ready for its public unveiling. And so he withdrew it. He played it safe, and he withdrew it from circulation, lest it cause more animosity from party officials. And then he started composing his Symphony No. 5. And he started with the symphony in April 1937, and he completed it in July 1937. And it was premiered in November of that year in St. Petersburg, which by then was, of course, and it was conducted by the legendary Russian conductor Yevgeny Mravensky. And so after the premiere of the symphony, Shostakovich waited to see what the response would be to his work. And it was very, very popular with critics and with concert goers. They liked the work very much. And more importantly than that, the Soviet authorities approved of the Symphony No. 5. They called it a true model of Soviet art. And so this Symphony No. 5 was, in a sense, Shostakovich's reprieve. He had gone from offending Stalin and putting his life in danger somewhat to earning the favor of the party once again. However, that reprieve was temporary, because a few years later, 11 years in 1948, Shostakovich and a number of other Soviet composers, such as Prokofiev, got in trouble once again with the party for their bourgeois formalism. So that was a theme that cropped up in the party's criticism of Shostakovich. He was guilty of bourgeois decadence, bourgeois sensationalism, and later on, bourgeois formalism. But that final criticism was in the future in 1948. In 1937, when the Symphony No. 5 premiered, he was in the party's good books again. Now, one of the notable attributes of the Symphony No. 5 by Shostakovich is its subtitle. It's called A Soviet Artist's Response to Just Criticism. And the title, or that subtitle, is rather obsequious. And to me, it has the tone of a penitent who has offended or has sinned against party doctrine. So the question arises with that title, did Shostakovich genuinely believe that? Did he genuinely believe that the criticism was just and that he had erred and had strayed and had now come back on the correct path? And well, maybe. Or perhaps was that title an attempt to make nice with party officials who had the power to destroy him? Was it perhaps an act of self-preservation by Shostakovich? And when you consider his statements and his behaviors later on in his life, like, for example, when he called the day that Stalin died the happiest day in his life. Unfortunately, just by the way, that was also the day that the composer Sergei Prokofiev died. But Shostakovich called Stalin's death day the happiest day of his life, and he lived in fear of a visit by the secret police for pretty much until Leonid Brezhnev took over the Soviet Union. So this subtitle, A Soviet Artist's Response to Just Criticism, was, it seems to me, likely an act of self-preservation. that Shostakovich gave the symphony that subtitle in order to make nice with the Soviet authorities. Now, this symphony is definitely a 20th century work, and it's not beautiful in the conventional sense. It doesn't have the beautiful and lyrical melodies that are found in the works of Tchaikovsky and Beethoven and Mozart, which those symphonies are rather an undulation of beautiful sounds, and that's a strong part of their appeal. This symphony is very different. In fact, the overriding quality about this Symphony Number 5 is its awkwardness and its coarseness. And the question arises, was that deliberate? Was Shostakovich's objective not to depict or not to put together a string of beautiful sounds, but was his objective rather to depict a state of mind? And that's the question that frames the symphony. What was Shostakovich's objective? Now, the first movement starts off with violins that set the theme for this work. The orchestration here is rather abstemious and quite austere, as if Shostakovich is trying not to be too indulgent and too luxurious. It's quite austere and abstemious. And despite the quietness of the orchestra, there's rather a menacing undertone to the theme that's introduced by the orchestra. So let's take a listen to an excerpt from the first movement. Right, as you could hear there, the orchestration is quite thin and quite austere, but despite how thin and austere the orchestra sounds, there's an underlying tension. And it starts to pick up a little bit, as you heard at the end, when the woodwinds come in. Now, there's a contrast in this first movement in that, in as much as the opening is understated and quite light, with very light orchestration, the second part of it quite thick and heavy, and it sounds quite grotesque. And the question that crops up when listening to this section of the first movement is, what was Shostakovich pointing at? What was he trying to get at or trying to reflect with such grotesque sounds as found in this excerpt in the first movement? Now, as you can hear, it sounds quite martial and quite grotesque. And to me, there's quite an underlying, or rather, not underlying, quite an overt sense of anxiety in that excerpt from the first music. And it goes back to what I said earlier, what I asked earlier. Was Shostakovich in this Symphony No. 5 trying to depict a certain state of mind? And that boisterousness concludes the first movement of the symphony. Now, the second movement of the symphony is a waltz. All right. Now, when I say waltz, most people think of something like the Blue Danube, which is quite light and elegant and tuneful, or something like the Tchaikovsky composition, the Waltz of the Flowers, which is so beautiful and it's so graceful. This waltz by Shostakovich, the second movement, is quite different. It's quite a heavy, lumpen, clumsy sounding thing, something that qualities that you don't necessarily associate with the waltz. Now, before Shostakovich composed this work back in I think it was the late 1800s, the composer Erik Satie wrote a work called The Bureaucratic Sonatina. And when I listen to this waltz, the second movement of the Symphony No. 5, I think of it as the bureaucratic waltz. Because of its heaviness and its clumsiness, it rather strikes me as being a waltz that's composed by a committee of bureaucrats. At least that's my interpretation of it. Take a listen to the second movement and, well, see what you think. That is quite a fun waltz. It's, as you might have heard, it's quite playful in parts. And in other parts, it's quite clumsy and heavy and inelegant. And of course, this is deliberate. Shostakovich knew how to write a good waltz. It seems as if he is deliberately trying to write a mediocre one. Now, after that heaviness of the second movement, the waltz, and the playfulness, comes the third movement, which is a complete contrast to the second movement. The third movement is very somber. It's quite a long movement. It's about 14 minutes long. It's like a long, slow procession. And it's quite tense. There are many harmonies in the movement that do not resolve. And it's quite mournful and funereal. And so I'd like to play just a little excerpt from that third movement to give you a sense of what this movement is like. The preceding parts from to the excerpt are very similar to what you're going to hear now. Right, that was the third movement of the Symphony Number 5 by Dmitri Shostakovich. And as you heard, it's very, very somber and it's very quiet. And it's like a slow procession. And there's something very funereal about it. Now, the fourth movement and the final movement of the work is a complete contrast to the third movement. There's a very bright and boisterous beginning. But there's still quite a sense of unease and disharmony to the orchestra here, in that if you listen to the entire movement, there are parts in which it sounds like the instruments in the orchestra, some of them are playing wrong notes, that they're out of step with the orchestra. But it's still like a very forceful and a very robust beginning to this movement that feels like it wants to overpower the listener. So let's take a quick listen to the beginning of this fourth movement. Well, as you heard, they're very bright beginning, a boisterous beginning with lots of use of percussion, but the violin parts later on were very jumpy and very nervous. And from that bright beginning, that section of the fourth movement evaporates into something quieter. But the quiet doesn't last that long in the Symphony Number 5, because this movement and this symphony ends with a march. Now, many years after he composed this work, Shostakovich spoke about the symphony in an interview, and he brought up the opera Boris Godunov by Modest Mussorgsky. And there's a scene in that opera where the people are made to praise the Tsar. And it's very forced praise, and they do it under duress. And in the interview, Shostakovich said, everyone knows that opera, and everyone knows what the march means. And he said very clearly that the march that's used in the fourth movement of the Symphony Number 5 is an echo of the march used in the opera Boris Godunov. And so this work ends with the march, but as Shostakovich hinted, this is not a march of adoration. This is a march of tyranny. It's a march of a people who have been tyrannized by their rulers, and there's something very threatening about it. And it's a really ugly sounding march that brings this movement to a close. Right, that is one of the more terrifying marches I've heard in my time, with the percussion, the timpani, echoing heavy footfalls. And so I've had excerpts from the symphony played for you to give you an idea of what the music in the symphony is like. Now, the music in the symphony is certainly not without its beautiful and lyrical parts that seem to calm one. But overall, it's a symphony of awkwardness. It's a symphony that has its ugly parts, and it's certainly a symphony with a lot of music that sounds rather threatening and rather ill at ease. And this symphony was Shostakovich's peace offering to the party at the time. And as I said earlier, it is not so much a collection and undulation of beautiful sounds, that perhaps this symphony is more a reflection of the state of mind of Shostakovich during a particular time of the history of the Soviet Union. And the recording that was used there was the St. Petersburg Orchestra with conductor Yuri Temirkanov. And I hope that you will explore this symphony further. It's really a wonderful work to understand and enjoy. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk. And thank you very much to U3A, and especially to Andrew Pierce and Simon, and also to Marlene Armstrong, who helped me speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dino. That was really inspiring. Fantastic to hear all the background to the music we listened to. I've looked at the comments. We've had a huge number of comments. They're have just been compliments, really, Dino. There haven't been any questions. They're just a lot of compliments, how much they enjoy listening to you. And thank you all very much. Are there any questions? I can't see any particularly. Let me just add Simon. Did you see any questions, Simon?
No.
No. Okay, Dino, thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation. We are going to try and download it so that anyone who's missed it can listen to the presentation again. So goodbye to you all, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you to you all for making it possible, and thank you for all those too on YouTube and listening who have commented. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Okay.